Stuart, as a doctor in neuroscience, what's narcissism and how did it become the buzzword of 2024?
Cool. Well, thank you for asking, and thank you for having me on the show as well. Because, as you may have gathered, I'm a little bit of an advocate for spreading the message, as it were, about narcissism. What I'd like to do, if it's okay, is to I've sort of taken some time to try and write about narcissism because, in itself, it's a complex subject. It's not a simple this or that. There's actually a lot involved with it, and what I've tried to do is sort of summarize what I think are the most important, so that people listening will understand a little bit more about what narcissism really is, and then we can get on to the why I might even include why it's 2024 buzzword in this. I don't know. I've never any idea how it's going to go when I'm using my crib sheet. So
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So the interesting thing, or the most important thing to realize, is that narcissism exists on a scale or a spectrum. And that goes from, at the least extreme end, that would be what we would probably want to call healthy narcissism, which we all have. And that would move through to a top end of the spectrum, which is what we would call pathological, or if you like, toxic, dangerous narcissism, which is highly destructive. So to start with, we all have narcissistic traits that are actually what help us to survive day to day. So if we're in an interaction with someone and we want something, then we may use, persuasion. We may be more insistent on getting it because it's something that's important to us. However, when we use those sort of narcissistic traits, those are always balanced with empathy. So that ability to appreciate how the other person feels, but also how what I'm saying and doing impacts the other person. When we start talking about narcissists, and when psychologists start talking about narcissists and narcissism, what we're talking about is where those behaviors move from being useful or helpful to where they become toxic and where they become dangerous. So there is a formal diagnosis of narcissism. It is a clinical condition. There are 9 characteristics in people that, if you've got at least 5 of them, then you are considered to be narcissistic. That diagnosis is called narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. That is a formal diagnosis. The only problem is, as we'll see, that when it comes to narcissists, they're probably the last people who'd want to put themselves forward for any kind of clinical investigation. And so the level of narcissism as diagnosed, they reckon, is somewhere between 1% and 2% within a population. If you were to look at the people who, the real numbers, that might be somewhere between 6 and 10%. And actually, in some areas of work, then that might go as high as 20% or more. So the amount of narcissism generally in the population is quite low. But if you're in specific areas, particularly areas like medical, military, where rank is highly important, you'll find an increase in narcissistic behavior, where someone is basically, more imposing their will and controlling other people, rather than just using it to get something that's helpful or mutually beneficial. So if I was to talk about a narcissist, these are some of the characteristics that you'd expect to see in a narcissist. So they're someone who's consistently arrogant, and they have an unrealistic, often unjustified sense of superiority or specialness or important. They're highly entitled, highly manipulative and coercive. So yeah, highly manipulative and coercive. They're often, they're nearly always compulsive liars. They see themselves as perfect, and therefore they're unable to make mistakes. They're deeply envious or convinced that other people are envious of them. They consistently crave attention and adulation from other people. They lack boundaries, so they will be in your face very quickly. They will intrude, just cut across other people's personal space into other people's personal space without it bothering them. And often they're above the law. So, I don't have to say this, go on social media, go on YouTube, and you see lots of people who decide they're right even when they're outside the law, but don't you know who I am kind of thing. It's almost as though their privilege allows them to stand outside of that. And all narcissists feel highly privileged through their entitlement, and therefore they're going to push the law and break it, really, again, without worrying about it. The interesting thing is that they have no conscience or remorse about what they do. So they will do all of these things and not worry in the slightest how it impacts other people, which is where a lot of their sort of toxic and psychological manipulation, if you like, comes about, because all they're interested is getting what they want, no matter what the cost. Despite all these outward appearances, and we often see these people, as I'm sure you're aware, they come across as being quite charismatic, confident, maybe super humble, maybe very thoughtful, maybe benevolent, like to give to good causes, highly successful, have a perfect family and a perfect marriage. This is actually a false picture that they present to those outside. So despite all of these things, they are actually incredibly fragile inside. They have very low and fragile self-esteem, and they actually need the opinions of other people to sort of as their thermometer to determine how much self-worth they've got. So they loathe others, they loathe themselves, but they depend on how they feel about themselves, about what people are saying about them, what people are saying about their wealth, their possessions, their status, these sorts of things. And this need for input from outside, they call it external validation, but this need for input from outside is known as supply or narcissistic supply. So if you think of the word supply, it's basically giving the narcissist what they need to feel important, to actually feel good about themselves. Problem of that, of course, is that it's very variable. So if they go to a meeting and they do well, they're brilliant, someone dares to challenge them, and what that immediately does is it undermines this false self. It causes them to ask questions about themselves. It actually exposes what they really know they're like inside, but they've created this mask to hide behind, so people think that nothing's wrong, whereas inside they know they're deeply flawed. So if you challenge them or catch them off guard, trigger them, then they're likely to not be able to control their temper well. They may erupt into a wall of rage, and that can get physical. Conversely, they may go quiet on you, disappear, say nothing, and if you're in a relationship with them, that might last for between hours and weeks, literally. So to sum up, I guess the narcissist, if I was a narcissist, you, everybody else, and everything in the world would be there to serve me and for my benefit, regardless of how much it costs you for me to get that.
Stuart, you said a lot of interesting things, and one of the things that I love of what you said is I've been having an obsession lately with concepts, right? I feel that we sort of know what some words mean, but we don't truly know what they mean. And so I like when people break it down into behaviors associated with that particular word. And I've done this with things like mindfulness, procrastination, self-awareness, all of them. And you pinpointing exactly what kind of behaviors are associated with toxic, narcissism, a sense of entitlement, selfishness, uh, being arrogant, being like a lack of empathy. All of the things to me sound like, okay, if somebody wants to identify or to spot a narcissist, again, as you said, is on a spectrum, and we all have this some level of narcissism, then we can pinpoint which one has like a higher degree of narcissism than other ones. But one question I wanted to ask you, because to me, it goes back to the beginning to that spectrum. You said that on the low end is a very healthy narcissism that we all need. But when you said that was on the low end, to me, I thought about like, what if, is there any lower end, like somebody who doesn't have any confidence whatsoever, who doubts himself or herself all the time, that is almost like there's not a sense of self, and he's lost. So to me, I wonder where that kind of person falls into that. And that's like a number one question. But the second would be, at what point, because you said that on the extreme high level of narcissism it's like 1 or 2% of the population, but at what point it becomes toxic, because it seems like more than 2%, even 5% of the population are toxic narcissism without being pathologically a narcissist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the important thing is that the assessments of narcissism go on the official diagnosis. The need to submit for a diagnosis is within the person. Narcissists consider themselves to be perfect and therefore have no need to submit themselves. So the figures that we see are a lot lower than we would expect. They are realistically between 6 and 10% and possibly higher. As for the spectrum of narcissism, it's a brilliant question, because the people who are very often targets for narcissists are those people who come almost, I guess it would be off the bottom end of that spectrum. And we call these people empaths. So they may have actually interestingly come from a similar position or background to a narcissist, and they've grown up feeling that their feelings are not really valuable, because they may have been either conditioned, or they may be highly sensitive to people and want to help, and they've been told no, that's wrong. And so what they then see is that part of what is naturally them is wrong, and so they try and avoid it, and that in itself becomes a problem, because every time they want to help they see themselves as being in the wrong, and that undermines self-confidence. It undermines their ability to accept that they have, a valid point of view, because they're really led to doubt themselves. And so those people, because they are very often naturally giving, I mean, there is a toxic side to that as well, that some people just develop into being almost pathological givers. They give to the extent that they damage themselves, and they actually will damage other people. People become so overwhelmed that they may then distance themselves from that person. And so the thing that the person wants most, which is relationship and intimacy with people, kind of actively pushes them away. But with those people, they are almost a perfect lock and key fit for the narcissist, because the narcissist is looking for someone who will please them, who will fulfill them, who will adore them, who will tell them how great they are, who will say, wow, that's a wonderful Rolex watch, or man, you've got a great house there, or you really love your car. That's what narcissists thrive on. And these people with very high empathy, overly high empathy, who don't always know how to control it, don't always have very good boundaries themselves, and so they're particularly prone to become victims of narcissistic abuse because they're the perfect supply giver, really. But that doesn't mean that the only people who fall for narcissistic relationships are the empaths. Anybody with empathy, which is basically everybody who's not a narcissist or not a toxic narcissist, has empathy. Those who've got good boundaries and know when to say no and stop are not really that attractive to a narcissist, because the narcissist can't get from them what they want, and they can't manipulate them, use all the other tactics that they use to get that adoration and that supply. But there are a lot of people who genuinely, if you're going into a romantic relationship, for example, you're looking for someone that you can love, someone you can care for, someone you can give to, someone who you hope will give back and kind of complete you. That's the basis of a solid romantic relationship. The empath goes into that almost being naive to the wily ways of the narcissist. They do everything that they do naturally. Initially, the narcissist will say, wow, you're just the person, you're the person I'm looking for. I think we're a match made in heaven. And they have this very, very subtle way of what they call mirroring. So the empath or the empathetic person is looking for a particular profile of person. What the narcissist does is ask lots of questions, which then the empath tells them the sort of person they're looking for. So just like a chameleon, the narcissist turns themselves into that person. So the empath looks at the narcissist and thinks, wow, this is what I've been looking for. And yet the narcissist actually has no intention of fulfilling any of their roles at all. So I think talking about that crossover point between healthy narcissism and toxic narcissism, the toxic narcissist, it becomes toxic when they manipulate and when their impact actually, or their impact on others, impact the health of the person that they're interacting with, because relationships are two-way. But as the narcissistic relationship develops, it becomes more apparent, even though from the very beginning it's actually one way. What happens is gradually that mask of being the perfect partner drops, and suddenly everything within that relationship is a take from the narcissist to the empath, to the point that the person with empathy will say, what have I done wrong? And then they put the blame for what's happening on themselves, which of course the narcissist loves, because that's exactly what they want. It can't be the narcissist, so it must be you. And once you get into that position where psychologically you are unsure about your own reality, then that's when things get really difficult, because that's when the narcissist begins to manipulate, coerce you into doing things, and gets from you what they need without giving back.
Wow. Ah. So here's the thing. I was you really opened my mind when it came to the empath, right? And I don't really know how to feel about it, to be honest with you, because I've always been this person with high levels of empathy, to a point that in my mind it's like, if somebody behaves in a certain way, I'm trying to understand the reason behind it. Now, I'm very curious about people. I'm very curious about human behavior. I'm trying to understand. And when somebody does something, I try to figure out the why behind it. I can have empathy for those people. And I've always felt more a giver than a taker. And luckily for me, I haven't been involved, whether friendship or romantic relationship, with a narcissist. And I wonder exactly what has kept me away from that. Because here's the thing, me as part of being empathetic, I have empathy for those people who are like me, who feel, I don't know if, see, here's the thing, I don't even know if mine is lack of confidence or self-esteem or this or that or whatever. It's like we all have that level of insecurities. We have that level of, not trusting ourselves too much. But one thing is to be like that, and another thing is to be a doormat and let everyone, be uh, stepping on you. When it comes to that, it's like, when does being an empath bad, and when is it positive and good? Because the image I had in the past, like those who were empath were just good. I mean, were just like good heart people. Now, I never consider myself an empath, just somebody with high level of empathy, but I guess it's the same thing anyway. But now that you mention all of this, I wonder when it becomes like unhealthy and bad for the person.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the first thing is don't worry about being empathetic. I think the problem is that when we have the opposite of empathy, which is narcissism, that's when, if you like, problems with empathy are raised because the empath puts themselves in a position where they are almost unwittingly taken advantage of. It's really interesting. I'm reading a book at the moment by a guy called Adam Grant, who's a professor at Wharton Business School. And he's looked at different characteristics, the people who naturally give, the people who naturally take, and also what he calls the matchmakers. So those people who would balance giving with taking. And the interesting thing that he's found is that people who give and give freely quite often lose out in the short term. So if you were just given one task to do, a typical thing would be like in he writes about the American medical school system, for example. So very often in the first year of medical school, people with high levels of empathy and who are naturally givers tend to get lower scores because they're the kind of people that will help everybody else in what other people don't know rather than focusing upon themselves and what they need to expand their knowledge. But as they move through medical school, these people who initially get the low grades accelerate away, and the distance between the givers and the matchmakers and the takers is vast because these people realize the importance of working together in a community. And so the narcissist, I guess, if you were putting a narcissist, first year medical school apparently is a classic area for high levels of narcissism, but that suits them well because it's all about their individual grade and working on their own. But as they go through medical school, as they progress to becoming a doctor, it moves away from individual characteristics towards working as a team. And so the giver is the natural team player, the taker and the matchmakers are the ones. Certainly the takers are less likely to work well in a team because they're not interested in the outcome for everything. They're interested only in their own outcome. And so in that situation, if you were looking at that in the first year, you'd say that being, it's a sort of a generalization. Oh, the givers are chumps. Basically, if you're a giver, you're a loser. And that's what the information and the message that we often pick up from society. But actually, if you look at the long-term implications, the most successful, funders, doctors, you name it, in any walk of life, the most successful people are the givers because over time they develop that reputation of being trustworthy, of actually people feel good about them. So if you've got someone who's arrogant, it's very easy for people to, when these people become successful, people will look to shoot them down because they've had a bad experience. Whereas when the successful people become successful, or sorry, the givers become successful, what you find is that the people who are there will actually root for you and vouch for you because they've experienced that empathy and that giving that you know that the person's displayed. So when it comes to empathy, empathy is, you know, it would be the ideal, and it is an ideal for all of us to have if we lived in a perfect world. And certainly if we go back to when I was younger, not quite Noah's Ark, but just after, you know, if we go back a long way, 50 years or so, there was a lot more interdependence within society. We weren't reliant on technology, on quick communications. If I wanted to speak to my brother, I would either phone him on the telephone, which was always short because it was very expensive, or I'd write him a letter. And so we got used to that sort of slower pace of communication, but it also meant you spent more time face to face and talking with each other, which is where that empathy and that sense of resilience develops as people, you know, disagree with you, etc. It's that kind of face to face interaction where the empathy, I think, developed, and it was necessary for survival. Whereas now it's becoming a lot more, the mantra is be individual, be yourself, you know, go on your own. But what happens when you do? Then everyone who tells you to do that turns you down, shoots you down in flames because you're not conforming to how they think you should. So I think we live in a much more mixed up world, particularly now, where people are encouraged to strive for aspirations, but when they hit them, that's the point when it's suddenly reversed. It's a bit like the narcissistic relationship where initially the narcissist builds up their victim time and time again until they're almost on a pedestal. And then at the point where everything feels good and safe, they flip the tables, totally devalue the victim, undermine them, make them feel worthless and completely disorientated. And that seems to be, I think, more of how, you know, how the world's going. So there's always a place for empathy. Empaths, I think, struggle most. Empath is it's again, it's terminology, but it's people who really struggle to set boundaries. Abraham Lincoln, for example, was renowned for saying, you know, excuse me, I have only, you know, my one vice is that I can't say no. So he clearly was not always able to set boundaries that stopped people taking advantage of him. And he didn't bother about that so much because his actual impact that he had on people through his giving nature produced massive results that didn't become, you know, that wasn't a big issue for him. But I think with you know, with an empath, if you've not got those boundaries in place, if you can't say no, and you can't discern when saying yes is healthy, you know, that's where it becomes more of a problem. But again, you know, your perception of healthy is probably not the same as mine. So if you feel able to offer your empathy, and at the end of that you see the good that you've done and you feel good because of that, then that is, you know, that's the ideal situation to be in. I think when you use that empathy and then you begin to see the negative impacts that people do rip you off, take advantage, etc., that's when when the empathy becomes a little bit more of a problem.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And to me, I've been banging on this drum for a while now, that I think the one of the biggest issues in society nowadays, and the reason why we are the way that we are, or is the lack of empathy. Whether you hear people having like dating issues or relationship or politics, almost anything, it's almost everyone became entitled, and it's almost like accepting your struggles or accepting your opinion is diminishing mine, understanding your pain is diminishing mine. It's like we both can coexist, and yet there's this fear of having empathy, of understanding other people, to the degree that we are isolating ourselves even more now. And what you said about the way that you used to communicate with your brother, whether it's like a short phone calls or through letters, but mostly in person, that I think the being the proximity that being be able to read body language and the exchange of energy between two people or more, I think that's what creates empathy, I guess, to some extent, based on what I understood. So does that mean that technology is making society become more narcissist? Could that be the case? Because it feels like now there's a higher level of entitlement and selfishness and all of that, and it seems all associated with technology, especially social media.
I think, yeah, it's one of those questions that you have to be careful which angle you come at it from. It, you know, the internet, social media in itself is not bad. It's actually, for some people, it's that lifeline that they never had that, 50 years ago, for example. They can see family members, they can be isolated but talk, and they can really feel connected. But I think what happens is when we substitute the the personal interaction for screen time, if you like, the reality is that we're more connected physically in terms of number of people we can contact, but actually we're less fulfilled in ourselves because our contacts have become lower quality through we have more and we talk about less. And a lot of what you see on social media is, you have a neutral medium, but the nature of being able to hide behind a device or hide behind a keyboard is perfect for the narcissist because they can assume a false identity, which is all about, like the narcissistic false self. They see themselves as perfect when actually they know deep inside they're not. You can adapt that false persona. You can actually say what you want totally unfiltered because actually as a narcissists have no empathy. They don't care less how what they say impacts other people. And also this thing with narcissists is that part of that whole false self is this idea of projecting sort of an ideal life. And you put those three things together within social media and you've got people who can, they can post pictures of them on a beach in wherever, some exotic resort. They may or not be there because it may be photoshopped. So they can present a false image of themselves. They can be totally nasty to people without any kind of accountability for that, other than perhaps being blocked, which is not a bad thing because they'll just then find someone else. And they genuinely don't worry about how they come across as long as other people see them as being successful. That's what feeds their sense of self. And so I think narcissism, social media is a platform for narcissism, and it's certainly increased it because, like the media, it's selective. They're not giving us everything to look at and make a choice. What they do is they curate one small area of their life and make it seem as though that's everything. So unless you've got the Ferrari, unless you've got the Beverly Hills mansion, unless you go to Antigua for your holidays, you're not successful. The reality is that they probably don't either. And so they're able they're able to project this false image which makes them feel good. So the platform for them is ideal. But I think in reality, one thing they've found that's really interesting is that even with all the technology, that if you have probably one of the best balances is someone who enjoys good relationships with people and uses their technology wisely. So the communication and the contact through the phone augments real life daily interaction. So the two work together, and the phone isn't a substitute for that personal interaction.
That is fascinating because the last thing that you said, that the best thing of using technology or even social media is having those relationships and then leverage those with technology, using them to have better communication, to even, oh, for instance, my family is all over the place. I have brother and sister that live in Europe, my mom and dad live in South America, and then we communicate with each other like that, which is great. But I think what the problem has become, and I think that you pointed out, is people having less and less of those human interactions and relying more and more the external validation that likes or comments and things can give you on social media, that whether you pretend to have a Ferrari or just a great life or this trip. I've seen, and I'm sure that you have seen it too, I go out and see people walking their dogs, I see people eating at a restaurant, people sitting at a park. The majority of them are just glued to their phone, and I'm somebody who doom scrolls too. If I'm by myself, if I'm home, if I'm bored, I will do it. But the moment I'm walking a dog, the moment I'm interacting with friends, I'm in the moment. I just like I don't even the 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 social media, the doom scrolling is the last thing in my mind. I really enjoy being in the moment and having wonderful conversations. But what I see is like even when they have quote unquote friends or families, I've seen an older couple just recently. They were sitting at a restaurant looking outside of the window. They were probably in their 60s, both of them on their phones. And to me, it's like, well, where's just the connection, the the interaction mean? It's like we all live in our own world, and yet we might be physically in the same space, and yet be so distant because of the technology.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the danger is that the two can be self-reinforcing. So, for example, if you're in a relationship with a loved one, that relationship is built on your personal interaction primarily. So if you go out somewhere and sit at a table eating, then that relationship, if you like, continues and you talk over the table. I think where, excuse me, where the technology comes in is that it's almost becoming a revealing point for people's emptiness. So if you go to a restaurant, and this is, I'm not trying to pass judgment on people, but if you go to a restaurant and you have a couple who are sat there with each other but on their phones, my immediate question is, well, what is the real relationship underneath? What's stopping you from communicating? What is it that makes that device in your hand more interesting than the person who's opposite you? Because research, I don't think there's any research that counters that actually being social, being in nature, enjoying to being with other people, walking dogs, relaxing, all of those things benefit our health, our longevity, our mental health, our physical health. And yet we still choose to default to this area, where, be it narcissism or otherwise, where we try and lose our true self. You know, we used to talk a lot about resilience, which is where it's possible for people to disagree with you and you walk away as friends. Whereas what we're seeing now is much more the narcissistic view, which is narcissists cannot see. If I was a narcissist looking at you, I couldn't see you as good and bad. If you've been good or if you've been bad, there's no way you could be good. So everything is two opposite poles. And how often do we see in society where someone disagrees with someone else and they become a hater? And that in itself is highly narcissistic in its judgment, because it means, if you disagree with me and I say, well, you obviously hate me, then I'm actually imposing my view on you, that your view isn't valid, that your view isn't good enough, that your view isn't right, only mine is. And I think things like you were saying with the phones, how people use them, how disconnected they are from each other, more often than not reflects inner turmoil and inner disconnection as much as it does, particularly when they're in groups. You know, if you're on a train on your own, you want to look at your phone, no problem. If you're on your own, consult your phone, because that's sometimes it's good company. But if you go out as a group and everybody's on their phone, then the fundamental question is, beneath the phone, what relationship is there to keep you together as a group? And either you're not addressing it, or you know there's nothing there, and you're just distracted to the point of the relationship being secondary to the food you're eating or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite sad actually. I've seen it. I've seen it a lot, and to me, it feels like I tried. I've become aware. Anytime that if I feel the urge of doing it, it's like I'm just gonna stop. I'm just gonna enjoy this whole thing. And even when you mention about the haters, especially on social media, I can have a lot of empathy for people, but many times I cannot wrap my head around those kind of behaviors. I guess people live in their own pain, and that's the way to just express their pain or to get rid of it or to vent. Who knows? And which means that with the increase of social media usage, and your opinion is not valid, mine is, we will create a bigger problem that I don't know if we are aware of that, where more and more people, we're just going to be more, what's the word I'm looking for, it's just more divided in that regard as a society, which again is never good, especially because we are social species. And even though we tend to be together, as you mentioned, the relationship is not the priority. When it comes to that, a lot of people is so self-absorbed. But going to the narcissism part, is there any gender disparity when it comes to narcissism? Which gender, if any, tend to be more narcissist?
Okay. With narcissism, we've talked about a spectrum of narcissism. There's also a different, varieties in which people present as a narcissist. So some people, and I don't need to mention any names, but they're big, bit larger than life, brusque, highly confident, loud, outspoken, very clear, very definite. You also have, those are what we'd call the grandiose narcissists, but there's also a group which may be those people simply under different conditions, or maybe a different group of people with a different type of narcissist. But they're very quiet, they're shy, retiring, they come across as being deeply thoughtful, they come across as being considerate, but underneath, whereas the grandiose narcissist is pretty thick-skinned, and although once you get through that thick skin, that's when you get problems. They're quite resilient in some ways to criticism, but if you actually touch a sensitive point with a grandiose narcissist, they're far more likely to become violent. Or in fact, no, they're not. I'm sorry, they're not. They are more likely to show that violence. The covert narcissist, or the person who's much more underhand, those are the people who, as I say, are much quieter and reserved, but do things in a far more devious and destructive way. So the covert narcissist typically will isolate the victim using the victims or mutual friends. So the whole control, if you like, of that victim comes from not just from the actions of the narcissist, but the way that the narcissist influences those around them. So if you're looking at the sort of the big, brusque, loud narcissist, it looks like there are more males than females. So a ratio of about 3-1 in favor of the grandiose narcissist. However, if you look at the people who display, less obvious signs, but much more subtle signs, equal 50-50 between male and female. And there's also I was going to say a species, and I don't mean that, but there's a group of narcissists that we call get the label community narcissists, who get their fix, if you like, from being seen to be good in the community, to be seen to be doing good. They don't do good for good's sake. They do good because of how it reflects on them. Again, in that group, it seems to be pretty much an even balance between males and females.
Hmm. That's pretty interesting. When you were describing the grandioso, then I kind of assume there was more male dominated because that's what you see. I don't know if it's just because of societal norms, gender norms. I don't know if that has something to do that women's like, yeah, just be quiet, don't talk, don't do anything. We have this, and they have to adopt a different method to showcase or to express their narcissist behaviors. But my understanding, because I've researched about the topic, I've talked to other people, that narcissist is both, nature and nurture. You have some genes that make you a little bit more narcissist, but then also the way that you are raised and your environment, your household, all of that have heavily can heavily impact whether you become an extreme narcissist or not. Which, to me, once again, being an empathetic person, I feel I feel sad and bad because for a lot of extreme narcissists, I would assume that it's not their fault. It's not that they chose to be narcissists. They were the result of the way of their genes plus the environment. When it comes to extreme narcissism, can this be cured or at least treated so the person can have more? I mean, can have healthier and, let's say, more normal relationships.
Um, One thing that people agree on is that narcissism, extreme, certainly the toxic end, what we call the toxic or pathological narcissism, they do not respond well to treatment at all. First of all, they don't show up, but then actually narcissism, as much as a disputed topic as it is, at the moment the jury is on the side that narcissism is a chosen path. So, for example, if you have two children growing up in a family where they are under the same influence from parents, be that good or bad, although there may be an increased chance of, for example, children of narcissistic parents growing up to be narcissists, because it is generational, there's evidence that it continues from one generation to another. Just because you have narcissistic parents does not mean that you're going to grow up a narcissist. Some children grow up to be like the parents, to be narcissists. Some actually grow up almost to be empaths, interestingly enough, because they've seen the damage that narcissism has done, and they are so determined not to be like their parents that they go the other way. But equally, some grow up to be normal, and they, what I think with any of these things, actually acknowledging and being self-aware is really important. Narcissists are not. They can't be self-aware. They have no ability to self-reflect, which is part of the issue. But I think if you're in a position where you think, I don't want to be like my parents, and you take action to get that sorted, then there is hope for those. I think once you've progressed into an adult and you're showing signs of pathological narcissism, the chance of them being treated is very slim. As I say, they don't turn up they won't. Why should I go for a diagnosis if I'm perfect? The kind of changes that they need to take in terms of being self-aware, etc., are just so alien and so against the narcissistic way of thinking that to be persistent and to have a long-term success rate, the narcissist gives up. So they may for a year sit it out, but evidence suggests that it's something like 5 years to get even a more aware narcissist. So someone who is still narcissistic but less they have some element of self-awareness and know they want to change. Even those people will fall out of recovery, either because they get dragged back in because it's easier to be what they were, or they just don't. They just sort of think, I can't carry on with this, and they lose the impetus and they lose that ability to be consistent and see it through. So the treatment, it's very interesting because a lot of psychological illnesses that people have recognized can be treated medically by using pharmaceuticals, using drugs, basically. So, schizophrenia, for example, or split personality, people can have that handled by using certain drugs. The thing with narcissism is there is no drug treatment. It's a personality dysfunction, and the evidence suggests that it's a chosen personality dysfunction, which may come from deep trauma. It may come from, a seriously bad and disadvantaged childhood, but there's also evidence that it comes from a privileged childhood as well. Because children who grow up with privilege, they get everything, mum and dad very often are so busy or doing other things that they don't feel they've got time for the child. So they make up for that with gifts and material things and anything but personal attention and love. And so that child still grows up empty and traumatized because they feel they've not been able to make their own decisions, or they've not been listened to, or they've not been able to get what they desperately need. And so even people who grow up from a privileged background grow up to be highly entitled. And there's good evidence as well that wealth insulates you from empathy or insulates you from reality. And so it's not necessarily the ghetto kids who grow up to be narcissists. Some of those grow up to be the most balanced, successful people in the world, as do members of privileged families. But both of those groups also will produce people who are, who are narcissistic, and families in between. Grow up normal, no problems, do your best, but still your child grows up to be a narcissist, and that's perhaps where the genetics, the predisposition may come in. I think the best way to say is that it's the jury's still out, and it's pretty early days of research yet, but there's a lot of work going on in that area.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. The human brain is is a fascinating thing because, as you mentioned, there could be somebody coming from a very privileged background or the ghetto or anything, and it's all about how our brain processes information, events, and how we deal with trauma, how we cope with trauma. And yeah, I mean, a lot of that things outside our control, and I can definitely see how for a narcissist to get treatment is like, why would I, if there's nothing wrong with me? Is everyone else is wrong, my relationship failed because they are at fault, not me, so I don't need anything. It's the complete lack of self-awareness to a point that I can see how even going on a treatment is such a threat to the self, to the ego, that is like it is impossible, even for normal people, to change I mean, change behaviors, or just become a better person. It is hard because the ego is fighting to keep the current identity. I cannot even imagine how almost impossible it could be for a narcissist to even change, because that image or that ego is much stronger than in most people, I would assume. But yes, Stuart, I've been enjoying the conversation a lot of insights, a lot of very eye-opening things. But as a closing question, and I don't know if I guess it depends on the person. But one thing that I've wanted to know more about, especially for people who might be in a relationship with a narcissist and they don't know how to get out for whatever reason, how can somebody challenge a narcissist, especially when they know when we know that they are very good at let's say gaslighting?
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. Gaslighting is it's this again. It's a technical term for this psychological manipulation where I'll pour myself a cup of tea and then say to you, I'm drinking coffee, and you'll say, no, no, that's tea, and I'll say, no, it's not, it's coffee. This is definitely coffee. And what the gaslighting is very much changing your perception of reality by basically by lying and by denying what you've said. So I think with the important thing to acknowledge is that narcissists thrive off any opportunity for input supply. So that could be good or that can be conflict. And in fact, conflict is something they thrive on more because it's not only something that they can use then, they can go on in future to use it again against you and also use it against other people to get even more supply from outside. So the narcissist is looking for encounters that will make them feel good about themselves, whether that means because it makes them feel good because someone says something nice, or whether it means because they criticize somebody else to make that other person seem lower and therefore they feel better about it. It's a bit of a sort of perverse picture. But dealing with it, that you've got this problem that narcissists have you talked about the sort of the child inside. Most narcissists have not developed emotionally much beyond 7 to 10 years old. So although you have the adult body, you have the child inside emotionally. And, if a child doesn't get its own way, particularly early in life, you get the tantrum. If a narcissist doesn't get their way, or if you say something that challenges them, that forces them to think about their real inner self, they react in the same way. And that either comes out as rage, which is, as I say, is this thing with, it can be anything from bad temper to physical assault to murder. And it's actually really interesting that people have done work on serial killers. And when you look at the characteristics of serial killers, how they see the world, how they see themselves, etc., and you line up alongside those characteristics, those of a covert or a vulnerable narcissist, that actually they're almost identical. So dealing with narcissism is you're not just dealing with someone who gets a bit tetchy, you're dealing potentially with life and death situations. So what you want to do is to avoid stoking their ego. And that might be a picture that's used, that's a lovely picture, is like if you're playing tennis with a narcissist, if the narcissist volleys the ball, you simply put your tennis racket down and walk off court. So you just do not engage. If they're looking for a fight or if they're saying things that are offensive or trying to wind you up, the best way to deal with that is literally to walk away and have nothing to do with it. But that's not always possible. So if you're in a situation where you feel you're being devalued, where you feel you're being undermined, one way of dealing with that is to kind of avoid immediate interaction with them. So rather than responding and justifying yourself, that's a real danger, that we feel we've got to explain ourselves or justify our position. It's exactly what the narcissist wants, because all you're going to do is feed them with more stuff that they can come back with. So avoid justifying yourself and defending yourself. There's a thing called grey rock technique, which is that when they're dealing with you, rather than answering their question step by step in great detail, if they they could talk like I do. I have no problems talking, as you've gathered, but they could talk to you for 5 minutes, and a lot of that is devaluation, and then they say something that's completely wrong. The best way to respond to that is ignore the devaluation, because that's all about them. It's actually nothing to do with you, and acknowledging that, getting to a point where you can acknowledge that narcissists hate everybody, including themselves, that it's not your fault, then if you can get to that point where you don't feel the need to defend yourself, that's very, very helpful. But also give minimum answers. If they ask you something that you can give a yes or no answer to, give a yes no answer. If you're in a situation where you feel you've got a chance to say something, you can set boundaries and say, if you say that, I'm just let you know, I'm leaving the room now because that's unacceptable. When you feel you can talk to me in a civil manner, let's come back and have the conversation. Turn, go. If you say you're going to do something, do it, because any instance where you say, okay, I'm going to walk out, and then they say, oh no, please stay, and you go, okay, then they've then won, and that's another hook in you, really. So it's about trying to
De-escalate.
that's the word, thank you. Yeah, de-escalate the situation, or not feed them with any opportunities for getting upset. Sometimes actually with a narcissist, if you know that you've got an insecure partner who really is into how they look, then just being able to put that into a conversation that could be awkward, you're feeding them with what they want, and very often they'll focus on that and actually miss a lot of what that you're saying. So it's a bit disingenuous, I guess, but it's a way of, it's all about minimizing risk to yourself, because if you don't, anything could happen, really.
Yeah, I really appreciate that lengthy answer because it can give people direction in terms of if you try to play their game, if you try to be at their level, you're going to lose. They have um, a they're more expert. They have a bigger expertise in that regard, and anything that you can say or do, whatever, will be probably used against you. And it is a nice reminder to have because our emotions can run hot, and then when we feel that we are being invalidated, when we feel that the person is attacking us, or they're putting us down, and then we need to defend ourselves, we need to explain ourselves, we need to just respond, and then you adding more gas to the fire, and it could make it worse. And knowing knowing that we have to de-escalate, to actually de-escalate the whole thing, is a difficult task, but it requires, I guess, time and training and practice, because it has to, I would assume, become self-aware with their own emotions and say, okay, I'm just going to stop myself right here, because if I go any further, I don't know how this is going to end. So having those reminders, I think, is a very nice way to put it. And you were very, very clear on very pointing things, how to behave when we are dealing with a narcissist in a way that we can protect ourselves, and even both physically and emotionally as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my if the take home, if people have listened today and got one message that they can take home, it's about, first of all, it's not your fault, it's the narcissist problem. But also, if you don't, if you're in a relationship with a narcissist, please don't try and justify yourself. You don't need to, because however you justify yourself, they'll find it a problem with it anyway. But the third thing that I think is really important to, or maybe fourth as well, but the third thing is to actually recognize, if people are at the point where they're recognizing that they are in an abusive relationship, that is a significant stepping point, because one of the things of the way that narcissists manipulate people is for them to feel it's all their fault, and for it to become so normal that from outside it would look totally abnormal, but from within inside the relationship, as far as you're concerned, that's just the way life happens. And that's where the narcissist wants you to be and where they want you to stay, because in that situation they just can continue to manipulate and get from you what they want. Once you hit realization that something is wrong, then you are empowered to take action and make a change. And that's probably the most critical point. But the flip side of that is that if someone comes to you who says, look, I'm not sure about this, I'm not sure about what's going on, but I'm really worried our relationship it might be abusive, you have to remember the narcissist has shown this false picture to everyone else to a point that rarely will they believe a victim who comes to them. And the most common response is, oh, I think you've got that wrong. They couldn't be like that. Are you sure? And so all you do is re-invalidate the victim and inadvertently take the side of the narcissist. So if someone does come to you and wants to talk about the relationship, first of all, it's highly confidential. What goes between the two of you stays between the two of you, unless you actually feel there are real safety issues, in which case it's up to you sometimes, discuss with them if you can and decide on a course of action. But also, if they've realized that if they've come to you and want to talk to you, the best thing you can do is listen. You don't have to have answers. It's not about being able to fix a problem. Men, as we all know, are great fixers. Women are a lot better at listening. But if someone comes to you and shares their point, particularly if they're male, because they're as likely to be, in an abusive relationship as anybody else, listen to them and listen without judgment, because that then allows them to actually feel that someone's listening to them, and they feel, the posh word is validated, but they feel as though they've got a voice, basically. And so by listening, by giving them chance to offload, you're enabling them to take what they think is something wrong, to articulate it vocally, and to realize that, that this is a real issue. Someone's listening to me. And then if if you acknowledge that there's something wrong, the next step is to look at protection for the person who's involved in that relationship, especially if they can't escape. But for that person also, if it's at all possible, which again it isn't, because very often narcissists will not only manipulate personalities, but they will control finances and everything else. So the victim is totally dependent upon them. But if they get chance to get some kind of therapy, it's really, really important that they get therapy with someone who's known as a trauma-informed therapist, because even though someone might be a therapist, if they're not aware of the impacts of trauma, so things like PTSD, that kind of thing, which reflects very often a lot of the things that people suffer in these in narcissistic relationships. If the therapist is not aware of them having come from trauma, they too run the risk of making it worse for the thing by responding in the same way that someone, who just hears from outside, well, are you sure that's true? Because very often the stories you hear will be so far-fetched and will be so completely different to what you would expect that it's mind-blowing. And in fact, the lady who really got me involved in, kind of in this in a big way, with the lady that I helped through escaping a narcissist, I remember her saying at one point, Stuart, if I was to write down my story and submit it to Hollywood, it would be rejected as being too far-fetched. So, with these things, it's not always easy to make a judgment, and we're not called to make a judgment. What we are called to do is, if they come to us and want to talk, give them a chance to talk, listen, don't judge them, but actually see what can be done, see whether you can help. And if you can't help, plenty of organizations around, both voluntary and professional, that can.
Yeah, I really really love that part that you said. Everything that would involve how to help others, because one thing is to be in a relationship with a narcissist, another thing is to have somebody who might be in a relationship, and sometimes we don't know how to help them, or as you said, sometimes we don't believe in them, or sometimes we just trying to give solutions when we just have to be a listener, and being a good listener is a skill that is being, it's been harder to find in modern society. It's just people don't want to listen to each other. People just want to go ahead and make assumptions, draw conclusions, and all of that. Yeah, I mean, Stuart, I really enjoyed this conversation a lot. It was like a pleasure having you on, but also a very insightful, a lot of knowledge, a lot of good things that it is good to know, and bringing more awareness into what behaviors are associated with this psychological, or this personality, I guess, disorder. I don't even know if that
It's
would
a
be the real
disorder, yeah.
term,
It's called a
disorder.
disorder. Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, what happens is, if we are not aware, we can get affected by, we can be traumatized by it, and then we can traumatize other people by our behaviors, even when we're dealing with somebody who's like normal. So once again, I love everything that you share with me today. But where can people find you? I don't know if you, where can keep up with your work, or I don't know if you offer coaching or therapy. I don't know exactly everything that if anything.
Spare me half a second. Okay, so I'm really bad at self promotion, and I hate it. And this is probably back to front, but I have actually written a book called Escaping the Void: How to Support Victims Out of Emotionally Abusive Relationships. And really, this is my experience from going through, from being very naive myself at the beginning of this lady saying I've been in an abusive relationship for 17 years or whatever, and it go it goes through that. It's it's an accessible book. I've written it I've tried not to use jargon, and if I do use jargon, in other words, words that people use like gaslighting, etc., then I make sure that I explain them so nobody is at any disadvantage. You don't have to be a psychologist to read it. In fact, I think most psychologists would probably not read it, although they enjoy it. But it's not got the right, it's much more aimed at general people, just being able to get an insight into what narcissism is, how it works, both in personal relationships, at work, etc., how to take action that protects you, but also how to take action that enables you to escape and move out of that relationship, which is that's the ultimate goal, but it's not always possible. And so a lot of it is managing and understanding how to manage. And then in the back, there are just various appendices with things on, reminding you how narcissists see the world, finding narcissist savvy legal help, all that kind of thing, which is all part of the story. So that is available on Amazon, and it's on any Amazon platform. So if you just put Stuart Wood Escaping the Void, hopefully you'll find a nice gaudily. Even if you can't read it, you can see it.
Perfect.
You'll need sunglasses to
Perfect. Yeah,
to
I'll
see
add
it.
I'll actually want to add the Amazon link to the show notes and the YouTube description. So if people just want to click and just get your book, because I think that it is a great thing that you wrote, especially make it digestible for the normal people that might not be very much into the psychological language, or the language of psychology, and then they can understand and help people around them more, and even help themselves by just becoming aware of some things that they might not even know in the past. So I appreciate your work and writing the book, and I'm going to make sure that it is up there if people want to buy it and just read it for sure. Once again, Stuart, thank you so much for being on the podcast and for giving us a lot of insights and a lot of knowledge around narcissism, narcissist behaviors.
That's lovely. Thank you for having me.